Hi guys, welcome back. Let's get going on these electrical arcs now. So the first thing we want to do is find what we're going to use as a source, and I'll load that source into our ArcGeo here and carry on with the setup. So if I jump back into my effects decloak, I do have the propagation particles over here. So let me just double check the lifespan. So that is set to 1. So basically if I follow this through, I have cached out our points. And this is the basic propagation sim, which then emits points, and then we're moving that back into animation space. So we can use these to source our electrical arcs as well. So first thing I want to do is actually retime this, because I want the arcs to be slightly delayed. So here's this will be our hexagons moving into place, and then we can have the arcs happening just slightly behind where the hexagons are. So it's more like a lingering effect over the main drone than an effect that accompanies the hexagons itself. So let me see if I can find my move to rest over here. And then we can just time shift this. So let's say 20 frames before. So then we're lagging a little bit behind. And then we can just move it back using our move to anim based on ID. So you can see there we have a slightly delayed source, but those are good usable particles we can use for the arcs as well. And actually, before I finish up the source here, I'm going to duplicate this and make an additional one. So much more behind, because what I can do here is I can have one that's even more delayed, and I'll just remove a few more points from this one. So let's say ID modulus 200. So we'll just keep a few points there. And I'm going to merge these together. And we can just call this out arc source. So one thing to bear in mind here is, so now I have basically two sources merged together. I have a dense one that's a little bit behind the hexagons, and then behind that still we can have a few more electrical arcs that just kind of finish up. So I need to add an offset to these IDs. We'll be basing a lot of the electricity on the ID attribute. So if we're splitting this up and re-merging it, then we run into a problem where we have some points with the same ID. So I'm just going to say ID times equals 10,000. Just to make sure we have unique IDs coming out through here. Right, and then jumping back over to our arcs, let's bring that point cloud in. So we have our source, and while I'm at it, I'm going to bring in the actual drone as well. So let's get started with this. For now, I'm going to actually throw in another delete and just remove a bunch more points. Let's go 1,000. Okay, because we don't really need that many. The only problem I see here is because it's only removed. That wasn't enough to remove a bunch of our second source. So I wonder if that's fine. Let's go with that for now. And then put down a line. Just choosing random values there for now and orienting this on Z, because then we're going to copy these onto our source points. Make sure we use template point attributes as well so we can get age. And let me throw in my random numbers. So random ID so we can have a random rotation, and I can put in a random scale as well. So let's double check that. Okay, so we're just basically covering this drone in a bunch of random oriented lines. And that's fine. And then we want to set up some attributes here on our points. So for one, like the previous video, I will put a p-scale based on age. Let's put that in a ramp. So this will define the scale of our lines. And I'm actually going to throw, if you remember in the previous video I said I like to fit that age so we can determine independently the kind of length of time it takes for our lines to do anything, and not be completely stuck to using the life of the points. So I'll say fit age between 0 and 1 for now, and then we can see how that looks. Okay, so now we should have a p-scale that goes from 0 to 1 based on the exact age of the particle. And if I adjust the fit, I can just tone that down a little bit. So I want it to move a little bit slower with its growth. I'm going to increase the length here because we need a good coverage, because I plan on raying these back down onto the drone itself. So what I'm looking for at this point is just firstly a stable copy of lines onto the drone. What feels like a good speed for the growth, and that's based on age. At the moment we're not really determining the lifespan of our lines because that's still set to 1. And then a good length that feels like if we ray these down, they'll make a good coverage of the whole drone, because we can manage then the length afterwards based on age as well. So that looks pretty good for now. Let's set up some attributes on our line. And for now, because we have lots of points in there, I'm going to make a mask attribute. So $pt divided by $npt, which gives us a value from 0 to 1 on the length of the whole line. So that's particularly useful when we start to do noise. But if we do resample or anything breaks, I can always just use the resample node to regenerate that that attribute there. What do we want to do now? Probably, I think, ray these down. So here's my drone. There are my lines, and I will choose minimum distance. Okay, so now we should be getting something a little bit messy, but still pretty good. I'm actually going to put in a color over here. If you remember, we have that fade attribute, which was my leading edge, and we can use that here to color our arcs as well, at least as an initial point color. So yeah, this is the one that's white at the leading edge, and then it falls off and becomes dark at the back. So now our lines will inherit that color as well. So we just need to ray those down. And then what I can do is I can mix between the straight lines and the rayed lines. So we just take the position, we'll use a mix. So these are our straight lines, and then I'll import the rayed lines. So second input position, and we can base that off of our mask attribute. So plug that into bias. And then if I come over here, obviously, is it this side? Yeah, so this is the end of the line based on that mask attribute. And the start of the line shouldn't really move because the start is already copied to the surface of the drone. So basically what I want is, I want most of this to be rayed down, but then we can make sure the center of the line is slightly offset. So just to give it some lift. So something like that. It's a bit messy, but we're still going to add some noise. But at least we've got lines that sort of semi-collide with the drone and move along its surface, but there's a little bit of lift in between. So here, let's put down another ray. And before we do that, another resample. So you see we're left with a bunch of lines here that don't have points. So let's bring that back up. Then when we do another ray, if we set the scale to 0, we can just slowly adjust this so that the lines start to sort of in a more tame way try to adhere to the shape of the drone again. So nothing major, I'm just kind of bringing those points back in. So make sure we have a tame-ish result there from our electricity. So at the moment we've not done much, we're basically just copying lines and raying them down. What I do have is a slow growing effect based on the age, so our lines are expanding slowly. But it's pretty crazy at the moment. So I need to think of something else to do, and I think at this point maybe we should just start working on the noise and see what else we can drive from that point. So I'll throw down another resample here and go pretty high res on these lines. We need a lot of detail there if we're working with a noise. Put down my VOP, and then just like in the previous video, I'm going to throw down a turbulent noise. We'll set that to 3D and sparse. We've got the position. I'm going to promote the rest up. So that's our noise. We want to add this to P. And there we've got something slightly more electrical. So first things first, I'm going to use this resample here and generate our curve view attribute, which is essentially the same as the mask attribute I made before. So that will give us a 0 to 1 value for the length of the curve. So let's bind in that. Put down a ramp. And then multiply this noise by that ramp, because I don't want to affect the beginning and the end of the curve. I just want to add that noise to the middle so that we can try and maintain our collision areas. So basically I'm just taking that noise and I'm multiplying it by a value which is the length of the curve. So that would move the start point, that would move the end point. We want to keep those down on the drone and just move the middle. So you can see we're maintaining our collision or our contact points and just applying noise to the center. And for now I don't have any motion on that noise. This is all just moving through the world and includes the fact that these lines are slowly growing. And I think we've actually already got plenty of motion there. So it's looking really crazy at the moment. Let's merge this on to the drone so we can view it a little bit better. That's a little bit easier to see. But there's still too many, and obviously we don't have any fading or anything like that. So let's jump back into our noise and do some stuff with our age here. So I'm going to immediately put down a fit so we can remap the age of that point to define a new lifespan for our lines. Let's put down a ramp for color. And another thing we can do is actually, well, let me plug this in over here. And then I can also bind export the color right now as the alpha. So there we've got an alpha already. Here we've got some color, and this is messing up my viewport, so let's add some alpha over here as well to our drone. Okay, so for the color, I do want the arcs to fade in slightly, so I don't want them to pop into existence. Even though the scale is pretty low, it's easier to just have a slight fade in to avoid any awkward pops. And then obviously we want that slightly slow fade out. So now they fade out just before they die. That looks good. Let's use the same fit, put down another ramp, and we'll use this as our amplitude. Ramp amp. So we can take this ramp and plug it into our amplitude for our noise. So here we end up with a straight line. So we want at least a little bit of noise at the start. And then we can maintain that. And then just before the line's going to die, we can ramp this right up. I can even go higher. So there's a burst of amplitude before the line actually dissipates based on that age. And the nice thing is now we've used the one fit and two ramps here. So if I decide to change the lifespan of these lines, the color and the amplitude are affected at the same time. So that's good, because here we can choose if the lines are only living for 40%, then we end up with less lines overall, and they don't live long enough to grow too long. So that's probably more like it, whereas if I leave this at 1, that's pretty insane. So somewhere further down this life, and we get a bit more of a clean image here. There's still enough time to see if we look at this line over here, there's still time to see the amplitude taking effect, so making that arcing motion. And we still see the lines extending slightly from the age, but they're dying just in time to feel good. So I'm going to flipbook this. Might just want to reduce that amplitude a little bit. Because I don't want it to lift up too far from the surface, it'll become too distracting. So we can manage the entire scale of that amplitude just with a multiply. Let me go a little bit more frequent. Basically just eyeballing at this point. Right, let me flipbook this. And I think that's a pretty decent setup for one video. Let's see how this looks moving. And we'll just carry on with this in the next one. There's a lot to mess around with there already. So we've still got pretty decent collision. I think what I end up doing usually is just at the end of any electrical setup, I do an attribute transfer of the position from the collision geometry back onto the curves. just to make sure if there's a curve that's very close to the surface but not quite on it, we just make sure that locks into place. And then obviously here we can still see some pretty dark curves, but we wouldn't see them because they should have a pretty much 0 alpha, I think. Yeah, I really like that. The only problem I'm seeing right now is that my initial wave of arcs actually has less points than my secondary wave. So I need to fix that. But in terms of motion, I think it feels pretty good. It feels quite snappy. We're seeing the amplitude effect, especially up here. They kind of want to arc off the surface of the drone, so that's pretty good. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's end it here and we'll carry on tweaking this in the next video. So I'll see you then.